Hi, my name is David Lee, and I'm one of the founders of Intervention Services and Coaching. And today, what I'm going to talk about is narrative building, or the art of the story and the narrative in regards to interventions and recovery and sobriety and all that stuff. So, in the beginning stages of every intervention that we do, we focus a lot of energy on a narrative, right? A story. Everybody has a story, all right? So, for example, in my family system, everyone had a narrative or a story in terms of my addiction or my mental health. If you were to ask my mom what my problem was, my mom looked at it, that David maybe has some underlying issues. David needs therapy, David needs this. My dad didn't look at it that way. My dad's story that he was attached to was that I just needed to get a darn job and quit doing drugs, and grow up and be responsible. My brother looked at it differently. My grandmother looked at it differently. So everyone has a story. And a critical part of most interventions is letter writing. In the very beginning of the majority of interventions, we usually read letters, and those letters are stories, right? Dear David, you're our brother, our son, our loved one. We care about you very much. I'll never forget when we were younger, and there's a story that we begin to tell, and we try to journey back in time and connect somebody to a time that they were maybe happier before the intervention. So it's all stories. It's stories and stories and stories. But what's critically important, so I've worked in treatment. I've been to a lot of treatment. I own and operate treatment programs. How people enter into the very first stages of recovery will absolutely impact the outcomes of their stay and their recovery afterwards. And so, like, a good way of looking at it there's how people change, right? How all human beings change is a combination of two factors. There is an external motivation to change and an internal motivation to change. And an external is something on the outside happens. Let's say maybe, let's say outside of addiction, let's say that, I don't know, I've been coming into work lately. My boss sits me down and he says, you know what, if you don't start coming in on time, we're going to let you go. So there's an external motivation to change, and one of two things is going to happen. Either I'll, turn it around and I'll start coming in on time, or I won't. Right? And so it's 100% of an external, maybe a little bit of an internal motivation. I want to do better. I want to be a better employee, etc. And so that's one option, and people enter into treatment with an external motivation to change all the time. So, for example, we have an outpatient program that people show up at, and people show up with a handful of different stories. And some of those stories are, whether they say it out loud or not, their story is, my wife or my husband gave me an ultimatum and said if I don't come to rehab, they will leave me. Or my boss said if I don't go to rehab, or the judge said if I don't go to rehab, be gone forever. And so here I am. I'm here. I have been grounded. I am in the doghouse, and therefore I have to come to your place and do this thing, and get done with this thing, and then hopefully put it past me and fix this relationship that I have. Make the consequences go away, the external consequences. And so that's an external motivation to change. Interventions, the original intervention style was very externally motivated. It was called the Johnson model, and it really approached people like, dear Timmy, you're our family member. We love you. Go to rehab or else. 100% external motivation to change. And you could, the success rate of getting people into treatment with that approach is kind of high on the front end. Full-blown ultimatums. The success rate of getting them into the next phase after that, which is recovery, not treatment, but recovery, becomes lower because my internal motivation to change is extremely low. I'm only willing to do a few things temporarily to get you kind of off my back. Now, in some cases, people that enter into the treatment system will flip. And they're like, epiphany, I realize now I have an addiction. I want to have a better life. But for the most part, the change isn't long-term sustainable. For most people, it's short-term. And they come into the treatment system, and they temporarily agree to kind of do X, Y, and Z. But when it comes to the 28th day, hey, we suggest that you do X, Y, and Z. They're like, whoa. Here's a common thing that happens in regards to like a classic model of recovery, which is the 12-step model. So let's say hypothetically I have no familiarity with treatment or recovery or anything like that, and I'm a drug addict or an alcoholic, and I knock on the door of the local rehab, and I say I want to check myself in, and I do. And I go there, and I'm there for a few days, and all of a sudden I start to hear things like they're having like AA meetings and 12-step, and these people are coming in and they're talking about going to meetings every day when you get out forever. You know what I mean? Like forever, ever. Like there isn't like go for like a week. There's a forever, right? And so I hear that, and I have a problem with it because I agreed to come here for 28 days. Like I didn't sign the contract that says come for 10,000 days. I signed for 28 days, which to me was a big deal. Like for me, showing up for a month is a huge, huge deal. And so I need to come here, be done with it, and move on, right? And so what happens historically with a lot of people is they hear that path and they begin to kind of struggle with it. Like, I don't know if I really agree with that or want to. And so therefore, all I'm willing to do is just this piece and kind of hope it worked, you know? And it's kind of like me. Let's say hypothetically, or not quite so hypothetically, let's say that I need to lose some weight. Let's say I need to lose 50 pounds. And I go away to like a wellness place for a week. And I go there, and they are going to feed me better. I'm going to learn about nutrition. And I'm going to work out a bit while I'm there for a week, right? And while I'm there, I will actually start to feel better, and I will get a little bit better. I'll actually lose a few pounds. And I'll mistakenly think that I'm in recovery. Okay, now here's a real big difference between treatment and recovery. Treatment, they're kind of doing 90% of the footwork for me. In other words, let me be very clear in my analogy that I just gave. I'm not cooking the meal. I'm not meal planning. I'm not putting the portions in front of myself. They're doing it for me. Okay? I may learn theoretical nutrition. I may learn theoretical working out stuff. I may learn about calories and carbs, but it's not real. They're doing 90% of the recovery for me. And I falsely think that I'm doing it, that I'm no different than the guy across the street who's like a super workout, super fitness person. And so it's like 6 or 7 days into this place, I'm getting ready to segue out, and I call my family, and I'm like, hey, yeah, it was really good. I'm so grateful I came here. Wow, we're so proud of you for going. Hey, when you get home, we should go to this gym that I go to. And I'm like, gym? What do you mean, gym? I've been working out every day since I got here. I'm pretty much done with that. I just got done doing all that stuff. I'm coming home, and I'm good, right? I'll eat better. I just won't eat cookies. Thinking that because I was in a place that didn't have cookies, I have the ability to be able to resist the cookies. And I'm going to come back home falsely thinking I'm better than I am. Recovery is when I begin to start to actually do the heavy lifting. I start to quote unquote walk into the gym on my own. I'm surrounded by a support group of people. I've hired a personal trainer who's kind of guiding me. I'm willing to fire myself as the decision maker. I'm no longer fully in charge. Okay, but I'm like 50%, 50-50. Recovery is the footwork. Treatment, little recovery. A lot of treatment, a lot of theoretical. Recovery, which happens after treatment. And this is where a lot of people kind of break down the system. And so why this is important is if I have an fully external motivation to change, usually what will happen is as we're bartering and negotiating in my family, they're just grateful I went to rehab. And they have a fundamental misunderstanding of the path of recovery. They're so grateful David in my story went to a 1-week wellness place. And they're wondering why 2 weeks later I'm putting on weight. They're wondering why 3 weeks later I'm eating cookies. He went to that place. He seemed to be doing so well. I guess it didn't work. You know what? Let's re-intervene. Let's force him into another 1-week place. Ideally, an intervention, at least our style, is not about a place. You don't want to intervene to get them to go to a place. You want to intervene to get them on a path. And that path, for us, is a 1-year commitment. And it's why we collaborate with families for up to a year. It is that we need to hold the hands of the family system as the client begins to push back at every single stage in this. And for most families, myself included, the best you can kind of get into is an argument about will you please go to rehab. Please go to rehab. Oh, hallelujah, he's in rehab. I hope it worked. What's he going to do? And then the majority of people, if that's all you've done, is you've just kind of temporarily agreed to go somewhere. And so let's circle back around to what I'm talking about, narratives, right? Stories. And so the one thing that I have, right, that perhaps you who's watching this, if you're like the family member of an addict or an alcoholic or mentally struggling, is that I have chapters of my life that are absolute disasters. Like a literal throwing hand grenades in every area of my life. Spiritually, emotionally, financially, relationally. I mean, it's just a disaster, right? Just the master of poor decisions. And I also have chapters that are really, really cool, right? I've worked in the treatment industry. I've been sober, houses, marriage stuff. Like cool stuff, right? And so, but in the middle of that is a line. And after being in recovery for a long time, right? I've done interventions for over 2 decades. I've come to really realize that those that really, really rock the recovery end up becoming passionately attached to their story. And you'll run into people like that. And so in the middle of my chapters is a line. I was a disaster. And then this thing happened, or series of things happened. And now my life is pretty cool, right? And so you'll know when you talk to some people that have really, really super rockin' recoveries, is they have a story that they love. And they're so happy to tell you. Well, here's what happened. I was homeless, and then all of a sudden this happened. Or I was running around, and then I got arrested. But actually I realize now I was rescued. And as I was sitting in that jail cell, an epiphany happened and I made a decision. Or this happened, or this happened. Or I was never going to get sober. And the next thing you know, So there's this story, right? The attachment to the story. In intervention is a curation, a creation, a setting the stage in place for ideally a story. A story that your loved one can become attached to. All people love stories. So, for example, I'll run into people that are married, right? They've been married for like a decade or two, and they got a really happy marriage. So as an experiment, take a couple that you know that's happily married and ask them this question. So, how did you guys meet? And one of them, at least, will light up. And they'd be like, well, let me tell you, here's how we met. I didn't even like him in the first place. And he used to chase me and he asked me out 15 times. And I always said no and no and no. And then finally, and they get so excited telling you the story, right, of how they met. The story of when he proposed, or she The story of when they got married, this story. And that story, the more passionate they are about it, builds a stronger foundation for the marriage. It's part myth and part reality. And so what ideally an intervention really is the making of a myth. It is a story. How much of the story that I am attached to, that I look back in my life, is 100% accurate? I don't know. Many people are somewhat unreliable narrators. How we remember things is a little bit blurry. Is it 100% true? I look back and I grab certain pieces, right? Through biased confirmation that will validate kind of where I'm at today. It's not a bad thing. It's just the art of the myth and the story and the narrative. And so the importance of narratives, kind of what I was bringing this up, is that as we're in our first stage of intervention guidance, right? We haven't had the face-to-face. We're planning for it. And we're writing letters and we're preparing for. Everybody has a myth. Everybody has a narrative. And what we want to do is create the possibility of a hero's journey versus a full-blown failure narrative. And so what's the difference, right? So a failure narrative is this. And I'm not saying we would do this, but let's say hypothetically we did. We show up and we're like, hey, Timmy, just want you to know, you're an alcoholic loser. Nobody likes you. You're a drunk. And we're done with you. And you must leave and be gone. And if you don't go to rehab, we're going to have you arrested tomorrow. Not only have you failed at alcohol, but we must send you away to this rehab for failures. And so I'm exaggerating, but I'm going to tell you that story, that intervention, if you will, happens every day. It happened to me. You get a family who's ticked off. They're frustrated. They're aggravated. They're just so resentful that I got loaded again. And guess what they do? I can't believe you did it again. You loser. What are you thinking? What are you going to do? You need to go to rehab. I'm not arguing that that's the wrong thing, but I will tell you it's a failure narrative. The number of people, myself included, that have walked into the doors of treatment again, and they say, I screwed up. I messed up. I had sobriety and then I lost it. I effed up. I failed. And so here I am for the place for failures, right? And so that is a failure narrative. I have started my recovery journey as a failure. And that happens all the time. You can flip it. I was broken, I failed, I screwed up, and I agree to go to treatment as some attempt to flip it into a heroic thing. But for some people, it doesn't land that way. I have lost significant number of years of sobriety. I have met many people that have had decades of sobriety and have lost that sobriety, it's a term they use, and have never been able to get it back because the failure narrative of what they lost was so significant. It is extremely difficult from personal experience to have done really, really well last year only to have slipped and then to walk into a treatment center again. If you've had sobriety or had success and lost it, it is impossible to feel empowered walking in those doors again. And so the story upon which we walk into is really, really challenging, right? And so what we strive for is not so much the failure narrative, is that we strive for a hero's journey. And what people respond to is different in every story. Some people are more spiritually led, right? And approaching an intervention along the lines of following spiritual breadcrumbs, or asking for guidance and asking for God's intuition, right? Creating that moment, a sacred moment. The number of interventions where we start with prayer is more than one, I will tell you that. And for some people, spiritual principles is the way. For other people, absolutely not. I have met and we have done interventions on people that were highly successful. They literally won at everything. Top CEOs, best house on the planet. a very egoic, super hyper competitive thing. And so if we just show up with that person and say, hey, we think you're an alcoholic and we think you've lost control over your drinking, and therefore you got to go to this rehab for people who lost control of their drinking, it never will work for them. That narrative does not work for them. And so on those interventions, I have sat across and made a treatment. We have carved out for them a treatment path that was harder, believe it or not, and sat across from that person and said, here's the Mount Everest of treatment. And why would that be important for that type of client? Because that type of client needs to go into something that's harder than everybody else's and look back and know that not only did they do it 100%, but they did a more thorough job than everybody. And when you plop that on the intervention room, they often respond to it. Another narrative that is common is that there are so many people that are discovering that underlying issues. So as somebody who is co-occurring, I'm duly diagnosed. It means that substance is not my primary. A lot of people think it is. A lot of people think drug addict is my number one. Underneath it, though, is I'm duly diagnosed, right? I have co-occurring mental health issues that often drive the bus. And if you have somebody that's a frequent relapser and yet is kind of trying, it often shouts underlying. There's an underlying co-occurring mood disorder or mental uniqueness, if you will. And the challenge is, unfortunately, because the symptoms that present are often substance, right? Hey, he relapsed, he's doing drugs, he's drinking, he's this, he's a drug addict he's a chronic relapser. But when you get to sit across from that person who's been in and out of the failure journey, they're on their 10th treatment center, when I get to sit, or we get to sit across from that person and say, it is apparent to us that you have an underlying, and it wasn't your fault, and you didn't know, and perhaps you were misdiagnosed. And if you do have an underlying, and all you're doing is working on the symptoms, which is the substances, you'll continue to struggle. It is a statistical fact that those that have underlying mood disorders have a 3 to 5 times higher relapse rate than people that don't, right? And so therefore, it's exceptionally more challenging. But if you don't know what's wrong with you, I hate to use that word, you will end up being stuck, as I was, in and out of treatment, forever seeking out answers for symptoms and perhaps missing some of the underlying problems. And so narrative building, we're in our very first stage, we're prepping for an intervention, we're writing and creating stories, is probably one of the most powerful things that you can do. And ideally, an effective interventionist is a storyteller, is a connector. There are 2 paths that we are attaching to, 2 stories, 2 narratives. Story A is the path of getting better. It requires an intention to at times be uncomfortable, to fire oneself as the decision maker, enter into the treatment continuum of care, a series of things which may or may not include residential, outpatient afterwards, a recovery coach, whatever it looks like, right? And so that is path A. And we, as your family and professionals, are here to endorse and support and help you on that journey, right? Or path B. And path B is not the path of getting better, is the path you've been on, which is the path of feeling better. And every human being has a right to choose either of those paths. But we as a family will change our relationship with your addiction based upon which of those 2 paths you go down. Intervention services, we're not really big on the ultimatum style. I think it can have a counter effect. I think it can blow back on you when done incorrectly. Sometimes the most sacred thing that you can do, though, is we love bomb them on the front end. We try to really, really get their internal motivation to change to be high. We put a little bit of an external motivator, and if that's not enough, sometimes what you have to do is temporarily step away and allow them, just them alone and their substances, to experience temporarily the consequences of their lifestyle choice. Because in many cases, what we have is a family system that is fully absorbing the negative consequences, which means that they themselves have reached the bottom long before the substance abuser has. So narrative building and stories is kind of the thing. And so what we're here to do is hopefully create a moment in time so that a year from now, your loved one stands before a group in their little support group meeting, and they begin to tell their story, and they give what's called a lead, and they talk about who they used to be and what happened and what they're like today. And that line in the middle, they'll say, you know what, I had no intention of stopping. And then all of a sudden I walked into the room and there was my family, some stranger, and I was so upset. And they read me these letters, and that was the last day of my drinking and drugs. I had no idea walking into that room that a year later I would get a year sober. And so that's the line. And if we do it right, they will be passionate about that line. And we're going to create the most sacred and magical space. And I have sat across from thousands of people in those rooms, and there's nothing more sacred than a family reading their letters and creating that moment of change. So that's kind of all I got. Just kind of a little piece on narrative building, and is it. Thanks.